Hi everyone, welcome to your next video. This one is religious language. We are finally into the last section of your philosophy course. We have covered all of our ethics now, we've covered all of our Christian thought now, and we are finally on the last lap. This is philosophy. So you have 2 philosophy topics in religious language and 1 on nature of God. So a few years ago on the old spec, there used to be 1 religious language topic. Some brainiac thought, wow, that topic is so brilliant, we're going to make it into 2 topics. So you have 2 whole units on religious language. They are about as dull as the title sounds, but on the other hand, they're fairly straightforward. So these are more of just a learn, and fortunately when it comes to an essay, you just use them against each other for evaluation. So it's quite straightforward in that respect. They're just a little bit on the dry side, but I'm sure any topic called religious language doesn't instill enthusiasm within you anyway, just by the title alone. So we are into the final section, however. So this one is on 20th century religious language arguments, verification, falsification, and language games. Let's get started then. Let's get this party started. All right, so your title is Religious Language, Verification, Falsification, and Language Games. First and foremost, you need to know there's 2 types of language. There's cognitive and non-cognitive. Cognitive are truth claims, asserting facts, something that can be known as either true or false, like your analytic synthetic ideas. Non-cognitive do not describe facts and cannot be determined as true or false. A.J. Ayer is our big name for verification. Now, if you remember correctly, A.J. Ayer has already come up in metaethics under emotivism, because A.J. Ayer believes that anything that cannot be verified as in proven true or false is then just an emotional response, hence why he says ethics is just an emotional response and can never be a fact, because you cannot verify it. That's because his home is within verification. But before we get on to A.J.'s verification, we first of all must set the scene. We set the scene of the logical positivists. So, the Vienna Circle, led by writer Maritz Schlick, apologies for pronunciation there, met regularly to discuss issues rising in logic. There they are, there's the Vienna Circle. The Vienna Circle was a group of men that got together in, you've guessed it, Vienna. They believed, following the work of writer Auguste Comte, that theological interpretations of events and experiences belonged in the past, to an unenlightened age when God was used as an explanation for anything that science had not yet mastered. So basically, this group of men got together in Vienna, led by Schlick, and they looked to the work of Auguste Comte, this idea of how did we find knowledge? How did we find understanding? We looked to God, and what they said was no. That belongs in the past. Leave God in the past. Leave God's explanation in the past to an unenlightened, uneducated time when actually science was not at the forefront. Instead, bring science now to the forefront of understanding and leave God behind. Comte called this the positivist age, when the only useful form of evidence for investigation was that which was available to the senses, empirical evidence, and that which could be tested via science. So this is the idea, hence the name logical positivist. Positivist or positivism, this idea of the move of science, the wave of science, investigation and senses. Logical, obviously, your science, your logic, your reason, your empiricism, all of this moving you forward into knowledge and leaving God and religious explanations behind. And this is where the logical positivists were born. I just think it was a group of men that wanted an excuse to get together and smoke cigars and drink whiskey, but they wanted a cool name as well. A.J. Ayer was part of that cool group. In 1936, he wrote Language, Truth and Logic at the age of 26, quite a good age to write a book. I do have that book on my shelf back in the classroom. It is thrilling. Please take the sarcasm there, but you are welcome to borrow it if you would like. Using the ideas of Wittgenstein and the Vienna Circle, he set down rules to judge if the language we use means anything. Wittgenstein used to be part of the Vienna Circle and then left later on to develop his own theories away from them, and we'll come across Wittgenstein in a few minutes. AJA focused on statements as being meaningful if they fall into analytic and synthetic. Now, that word meaningful is extremely important in a religious language essay, in a religious language argument. They're not trying to say whether they have importance to an individual. The statements might be very, very important and very meaningful to them, but this idea of meaningful as far as science, meaningful as far as verification, meaningful as far as analytic and synthetic. So he's not arguing that they're not important to that person, but what he's arguing is, do they have meaning in that sense? Analytic, as we know, true by definition, so dictionary definition, so all bachelors are unmarried men. These include tautologies. Tautologies are statements where they say the same thing twice. So ice is icy. Ice is icy. So you're saying the same thing twice. So that is tautologies. All mathematical statements as well. All of these have meaning. Synthetic is not part of a definition, but you need additional information to back them up. So Herbert is a bachelor. You need, that's not part of the definition of Herbert, and you need to find Herbert to go, oh yeah, you're not married, you're a bachelor. So you need evidence to back it up, empirical evidence, but once you've found that empirical evidence, you can still say it has meaning. So you might meet Herbert and he's actually got a wedding ring and you go, actually that's a false statement. It still has meaning though, because you can still prove it true or false. So the verifiability theory, if a statement is neither analytic nor empirically verifiable, it therefore says nothing about reality. It is meaningless or not factually significant. The criterion we use to test the genuineness of apparent statements of facts is the criterion of verifiability. Now, I really, really like that quote. Not only does it use the word criterion twice, which always sounds good, but it's this idea of testing. Test is a very close word with verifiable, but it's this idea of genuineness of apparent statements. Does that statement have any factual background without you being able to verify it in some way? Statements have to be capable of being tested and understood, understand what conditions are needed to call them true or false. In other words, in order for any statement to be meaningful, it has to be verifiable using empirical methods. So you very much use the same language over and over again. Test, empirical, verifiable, meaningful, etc. So where does religious language fall into this? Firstly, any religious language or claims about God, such as God created the world, or God answers my prayers, or the Lord is my shepherd, can't be verified. You can't prove them true or false by your senses, therefore they are meaningless. Thus, God is perfect, immutable, transcendent, tell us nothing about the world around us, and are talking of ideas beyond human sense observation. Similarly, religious experiences are also meaningless, as they are not verifiable because one is recounting a set of emotions. Secondly, religious believers cannot state under what circumstances they could call these claims true or false, nor can they suggest a test which could help solve this either. So what that's saying is because not only can you not verify them, you also cannot come up with kind of a checklist or a way of verifying them. There's no way you can ever verify this, so there's no way of ever finding meaning behind these statements. Ayer is not arguing that such statements are not important, just that they are unverifiable and therefore have no factual significance. They're not facts. Such a reality have all been devoted to the production of nonsense. Love that quote. So the reality of religious language has all been devoted, nice use of the word devoted there, to the production of nonsense. So one important thing throughout this is to make sure that you get sufficient strengths and weaknesses, what works and what doesn't work. So I'll always give you examples and options, but you need to really extend them and decide, does it work, does it not work? And does this mean that the verification principle successfully renders religious languages meaningless or not? So is it successful? Is what has been argued so far successful in saying that religious language is meaningless? There are a few problems with verification, as you can imagine. Swinburne, for example, said that generally people accept all ravens are black, but there's no way to confirm this statement. You cannot be proved true or false, but it's still got meaning. What he's saying is there's certain things that you can never, ever accurately say for all this or all that, all swans are whatever, or all ravens are black, or, you know, it doesn't have to just be animals. So it could be, you know, any all statements are very, very hard to verify, but they still have meaning. When I say to you all ravens are black, that still has meaning, even though you might not ever be able to say whether that's true or false. Strict scientific views mean that statements people say, such I'm not feeling very well, are meaningless, even if they make perfect sense, because they are based on emotion and feeling subject to the individual. So again, there's certain things that can be verified. There's certain things that that do have meaning, even if it is subjective to that individual, because somebody might not feel very well and someone else might have exactly the same symptoms and feel fine, etc. So these statements, they'll still have meaning. I mean, think about if a student came to me and said, I'm not feeling very well, and I turned around and said, well, that's meaningless. Ayer presents strong verification, something that can be verified conclusively, 100% by observation and experience. This means that no statement can be made about history, as these cannot be verified as facts with sense observation, always via second-hand information. So Ayer presented strong verification, something that you can 100% verify. But you can't 100% verify anything in the past. You can't 100% verify that Henry VIII had multiple wives. You can't verify the Battle of Hastings. You can't verify anything because you weren't there to see it with your own eyes. But of course we know these things happen. Of course we know these things are true. We don't need to see it with our own eyes. Ayer did later recognise that this didn't work and said that strong verification had no possible application. He realised that actually his own argument did not work. Further criticisms. Verification itself is unverifiable. The statement it makes about verifying something as true or false, you can't actually verify as true or false. So the statements are only meaningful if verifiable by sense observation is itself unverifiable. The argument itself cannot be verified. Also, talking of God is eschatologically verifiable. What that means is John Hick presented this idea that you can verify it once you're dead. This idea of eschatology, this idea of an afterlife, death, what happens when life has ended. He suggests that religion is not meaningless because the truth is verifiable in an afterlife. It's either true or false. You're either dead or you go somewhere else. But either way, you can see it as true or false and therefore is verifiable. In other words, one can verify the truthfulness of an afterlife once you are dead. This is the idea of the celestial story. Basically, two people are walking along the same path. One's an atheist, one's a believer, but neither of you will know which one of you is correct until you turn that corner of death and see whether there is a celestial city there or not. Evidence problem. What counts as evidence? This is always the biggest issue when criticising religious views. So for example, when you did religious experience back in the first year, people were saying that that's not that experience isn't valid or reliable. Well, why not? Why is that experience not valid or reliable and other experiences are? What counts as evidence? Ayer says religious experiences are rejected. However, researchers said there is clear evidence such experiences happen and God cannot be ruled out. Therefore, can religious experiences be verified weakly? Weak verifiability is this idea that it could be probable by observation experience. Ayer did also recognise later that weak verification was far too liberal. So he came up with strong, which had no application, and weak, which was far too liberal because it allowed for anything. But still, you can't just keep changing your arguments when they don't fit or work. So he still presented them. And at the end of the day, can't religious experiences be weakly verifiable? Why is the evidence that they're presenting, their accounts they're presenting, not valid in some way? Finally, what can be verified? Poetry, music, Shakespearean sonnets, none of these can be verified, yet they still have meaning. Not everything needs to be true or false to have meaning. Right, so that's your first section, done. That's verification. Falsification now. The main name for this is Antony Flew. Antony Flew, we've come across him bits and bobs over the years. He's the leaky buckets guy, so he's the one that said in religious language that you can have 10 leaky buckets doesn't make one good bucket, having 10 weak arguments doesn't make a strong argument, so that's Antony Flew. And we also, he's also the one that says about personal identity, Joe, who is the Joe that's been buried and who's the Joe watching his own funeral. So we have come across him in one or two places. He's dotted around the course. But he falls quite strongly and quite significantly within the falsification principle. So let's see what he says. Antony Flew's article, Theology and Falsification, in a symposium, this was a group that met to discuss a particular theme, of Oxford philosophers in 1950, Flew presented his article on falsification as a modification of VP, verification principle. So this is his alternative. He drew on the work of the Logical Positivists, but suggested that rather than focusing on verifiability, the focus instead should be on falsifiability. It is not about presenting empirical evidence in support of something, but about asserting something and at the same time knowing what evidence counts against it. So it's the idea of finding what proves it wrong rather than what proves it right, so to speak. An assertion which does not rule out anything, but rather is compatible with any conceivable state of affairs, does not appear to assert anything either. So this is C.S. Evans. So it's the idea there that you have to know what counts against it, otherwise something that just has everything going for it doesn't really say anything either. For example, I've spent my money teaching a philosophy class that would rule out other things I could not be doing. I could not, for example, be baking a cake or flying to Hawaii or paddleboarding in the North Sea. This is quite a funny example since we're now in lockdown. So, to be honest with you, baking a cake would probably be a possibility now. But certainly flying to Hawaii would be a big no-no. And paddleboarding in the North Sea, it is currently snowing. So I would be fairly crackers if that was the case. But you get the idea. You get the idea that when you assert something, so you give a suggestion, you also then rule out other options as well to show that that has meaning. This is how alibis work in court. If the defendant can show what they were doing at the time of the crime, this rules out their participation in the crime. In other words, they can prove the statement false by presenting what counts against it. So I did send you a cut and stick for the Flew, Ayer and Mitchell, so the 3 stories. I do recommend you doing that before moving on, mainly because the cut and stick will cut down how many notes you have to write and how much you have to physically write down. So please do have a go at the cut and stick in somewhere. I know it's more difficult at home, but even if you move them into columns and then print it out, but you have to have this in your notes. So even if you just write down what's on the next few slides instead, that is fine. But the cut and stick is to help minimise your writing. So, Flew, in a university debate, he uses John Wisdom's parable of the gardener for his article, Gods. Basically, I'm just going to put the parable up there. There are 2 explorers in a jungle where flowers and weeds are growing. One explorer believes... Let me start that one again. There are 2 explorers in a jungle, and as they're going through the jungle, they find a clearing. And in this clearing, there's flowers, and the grass is being cut, and it's being tended to, and it's neater, and it's more organised. One of the explorers says that there must be a gardener. There must be somebody that is planting the flowers and looking after it and keeping it in that way. The other explorer believes that there is not a gardener. And so they set their watches, they set cameras, they set dogs to catch the gardener in action. So they do everything to try and catch this gardener in action, to try and catch this gardener planting the flowers or tending to it. When the gardener is never detected, the first explorer just says, oh, well, we can't see the gardener on the cameras because the gardener's invisible. Oh, well, the dogs must not be able to sense it. Or we're coming at the wrong time of day, so that's why we never see it. So what happens is the other explorer just says that what makes this gardener real are just not invisible or just not exist at all. So what they're saying is this idea that the first gardener, the first explorer constantly changes his view from there being a gardener to a gardener that's invisible, a gardener that's not sensed by dogs, a gardener that only comes out at night, a gardener that whatever, constantly changes his criteria for that gardener. Whereas the second one just says, why is there a gardener at all? A gardener that we can't find, we can't prove, we can't verify, we can't falsify. Why does that gardener exist at all? And so this is an analogy to explain a religious perspective. People go on believing in God and no experience can falsify or prove it wrong. They always have an answer. The believers end up modifying their statements about God when challenged. The statement no longer resembles the original claim about God. Basically what it's saying is that somebody believes in God and you might say to them, well, what about problem of evil? Oh, well, so God's all loving. What about problem of evil? Oh yeah, but God is all loving, but it's a test. Or God is all loving, but it's our free will. But God is all loving. And they constantly are justifying it. They're constantly changing. Oh yes, but God has nothing to do with that. Or, oh yeah, but God doesn't see that. Or, oh, God doesn't come into the future. It's constantly an answer. There's constantly a change. And so what happens is the God that they start with and the God they end up with are two different gods. They're constantly changing the goalposts on their religious faith. No matter what you say, you will never falsify or find evidence against their belief. What all they're saying is that if someone said they're a religious believer and you say, well, what about, the Stephen Fry example of, the bugs that eat the children's eyes, etc., and the problem of evil, and someone just turns around and goes, yes, actually, that is a really, really hard bit of evidence to justify God. That's fine. They've acknowledged that it makes it difficult. They've acknowledged that there might be a falsehood in their belief, but they've still got that belief. And so it's just acknowledging those falsehoods, acknowledging those statements that may go against rather than constantly changing the goalposts. Anthony Flew gives this quote. He says, their belief in God dies a death of 1,000 qualifications. Now, this is one of my favourite quotes on the course. I think it's a really, really good quote. Basically, what he's saying is that you are qualifying, giving qualifications for God and so many different qualifications that actually your original assertion dies a death. Your original assertion, the original idea, dies every time you change it. So imagine going for a job interview with your qualifications and presenting yourself as a person. They then ask you questions and you go, oh yes, but I have done that as well. And, oh yes, I can do that. And, oh yes, I didn't mention that. And oh yeah. The person you come in with and the person that leaves are two different people. And so that original person dies a death of 1,000 qualifications. This means the original belief, God loves us all, is lost due to the amount of qualifications that used to justify the idea. So against the problem of evil, for example, often used against God. For example, when believers say God is different from us, they end up with a description of God that has no content because their statement is empty. God is different from us. Well, what does that mean? It has no content to it. They are meaningful. They are not meaningful, but vacuous, empty. Thus, when theists talk about God, a religious believer talks about God, they refuse to rule out any state of affairs. If asked, under what circumstances would your statement that God loves us be false, they would not be able to think of any. Whatever happens, however cruel or unjust, they still cling to that original assertion, all the while qualifying it with claims that God's love is mysterious or doesn't operate in accordance with normal ways of we expect love. So there's constantly an answer. There's constantly a reason why. Rather than just an acknowledgement of, yeah, I might be wrong, but I still want to believe in God. Peter Videy gives the example of a friend talking about her boyfriend, and no matter how awful he is, they will never accept they are not right together. I was on a course a number of years ago, one of Peter Videy's courses, where he gave this as an example, and he asked some of the students on the front row, they were mortified, and asked one of the girls if she had a boyfriend, and things like that. And I can't remember whether the girl said yes or no, it was by the by. And this boyfriend, he said, was forgot her birthday, cheated on her, was abusive, would never do anything she wanted to do, etc., etc. But no matter how horrible he was, she'd always go back to him. She'd always say, oh, we're right together. She'd say, oh, we're still meant to be together, etc. And so he said that then dies, the death of 1,000 qualifications. You're constantly qualifying your relationship, but actually it has no meaning. It's vacuous, it's empty. RM Hare pops in not, sorry, I always smile. Quite a few years ago now, a student said, arm hair. No, RM hair. So please put RM hair, not arm hair. RM hair was part of a symposium in Oxford, and along with Basil Mitchell, was invited by Flew to present responses towards his falsification approach. Hare gave the first and probably most radical response to Flew's article, Radical in Philosophy. He agreed that Flew had succeeded in demonstrating the failure of religious language to make meaningful truth claims. However, Hare suggests that when people use religious language, they should not be interpreted as truth claims in a cognitive sense, true or false, but as an expression of what he calls a blick. For Hare, religious claims are expressions of personal attitudes or commitments of a particular way of life. So they're non-cognitive. They are not testable assertions, but a way of showing how the speaker views the world. Basically what he's saying is you can't criticise religious views as not being true or false under the cognitive sense because they're not actually cognitive, they're non-cognitive. So when somebody says something to do with their beliefs in God, and then you use falsification against them, therefore it doesn't have meaning, it's not true or false. What Hare's saying here is, yeah, but they're not trying to say it is cognitive. They're saying it's non-cognitive. It's an emotional response. It's a feeling. They're not asserting it. It's an expression of a personal attitude. Therefore, falsification works only when asserting cognitive claims, whereas religious language falls into non-cognitive territory, do not describe facts and cannot be determined as true or false, therefore need to be viewed as a blick. We find what a blick is on the next slide. A blick, an expression of a personal interpretation of the world. So a blick is a personal expression. It is non-cognitive, and therefore you can't use a cognitive approach against it. Alright, so blick. This was a term created by Hare. He used the parable of a lunatic who believes all his teachers at university are trying to kill him. This is the way in which the lunatic saw the world, and nothing could change his view of the world. Hare coined the term blick to describe the way in which people see and interpret the world. A blick is a framework for understanding the world and finding meaning in it. The importance of a blick is that they are not falsifiable. They are man's unfalsifiable conviction. No matter what you say, they will always believe it. In other words, no evidence or argument can demonstrate the falseness of a blick. We'll come to the however in a second. So, I think this argument is actually quite clever. We all have blicks. You might just not be aware of them. It might be easy to see the blicks of your family or your friends more obviously. So let's just go back to the lunatic example first and foremost. The lunatic was a student that believed that all his lecturers were trying to kill him. And so his friends would say, well, what evidence have you got? Why do you believe that? And so they talk through with the lunatic or the student why he thought these lecturers were trying to kill him. And the friends would say, but I don't think it was that and I don't think it's that. But no matter what you said, they still believed and blinkered that belief that the university lecturer were trying to tell them. It's when anyone has a blinkered view that no matter what you say to them, they will always still believe it. So I remember I had a student many years ago now, and we had a constant battle between her believing she was a C grade and me believing that she could do better. And so no matter what evidence I would present, no matter what, I'd say, oh look, you've got a B in this thing, or you're doing really well in this, or you've got full marks this. No matter what evidence I would give to her, her blick was that no, I will only ever get a C. And that was her blick, and no matter what evidence I presented, I could not change that view. And so we all do have them. We all have things that we believe 100%, and no matter what people tell us, we believe them. You cannot falsify a blick. You cannot find falsehood about it because that is just what the person believed. Obviously, the difficulty with this, though, is that he's obviously siding this with religious believers. Is he saying that religious believers are lunatics? I'm not sure. It's a bit of a touchy one, I think, for this as an example. However, Flew pointed out that many religious believers intend their claims to be cognitive, e.g. Jesus rose from the dead, so Hare's non-cognitive approach does not work. Now, this is very important. If a religious believer makes a claim that they are saying is a fact, then you can use falsification against them. Whereas if they're just saying, well, it's just my belief, then you can't. So Ayer is saying that it's just a belief that they've got, so it's non-cognitive. And what Flew is saying is, hang on a minute, actually, some claims that religious people make, like Jesus was born a virgin, rose from the dead, etc., as fact, and therefore you can use a factual cognitive argument against them, like falsifiability. Basil Mitchell presents the parable of the partisan, a resistance fighter, and the stranger. The partisan meets a stranger who makes a strongly favourable impression on him. The stranger asks the partisan to trust him. The partisan makes a commitment to the stranger, so even if the stranger helps those on the other side, his commitment does not change. He even defends the stranger to the other resistance fighters. He tells himself that there is a reasonable explanation for the stranger's behaviour, even if it does not always know the details of it. Basically, this is about trusting somebody wholeheartedly. Trusting somebody even if you think that they're doing things that you don't understand, trusting there's a reason for that. So this is the idea, so the fighter and the stranger, there's no importance with who they are. It's this idea of meeting somebody and just trusting them, wholeheartedly trusting them. Mitchell's view is different from Ayer's because he is arguing that religious beliefs do have factual content, so they are cognitive. There is still actual content to religious assertions of the existence of a loving God. Mitchell also differs from Ayer, in that Ayer argues that beliefs are groundless, they're unsupported, there's no reason why people believe the beliefs they have. Whereas for Mitchell, the partisan's trust in the stranger is not groundless. He's made a deliberate, free will, conscious choice to trust the stranger. Believers who do not accept weight of evidence against their beliefs is guilty of failure of faith as well as logic. So basically, he's just arguing that if you don't accept evidence against your view, then you're not only failing your beliefs, you're also failing logic, that you should always look to the alternatives. Potential problem, though, is that the partisan meets the stranger, so has some grounds to trust him, whereas religious believers have never actually met God face to face, because obviously we're the fighters and the stranger's God. That's what the story is about. However, the fighter meets the stranger face to face, whereas we never meet God face to face. So there's even more trust, and there's even more leap of faith there. Mitchell says that religious believers have to take care not to create a vacuous formulae which experience makes no difference. Now, again, for me, this is probably one of my favourite philosophical quotes. What he's saying, vacuous, a vacuum is the tightest containment known to man. It's man-made, but basically nothing can go in or get out. Even the smallest minuscule microscopic particles cannot get in or out. It's a vacuum. It's tight. And so what he's saying is you can't create a formula for your own belief where no experience makes difference, where nothing can get in or out. So the example I always think of for this one, a number of years ago when I was a teacher training, I met a student who was studying for history. So we were studying for history, and the student turned around and said, the other trainee teacher turned around and said, oh, I could teach RE. Everyone always says that. Oh, I could teach about RE. It's God. I could do that. And I knew that this individual was quite a strong Catholic, hence why she thought that she could quite easily teach RE. And so I thought, well, let's give it a go then. So I said, oh, what are your views on abortion? What are your views on contraception? What are your views on euthanasia? Whatever it was. And we had these little discussions about them. She was fairly open, and I thought, yeah, okay, this is open, open-minded enough to maybe, think about teaching RE. And then I said, what about capital punishment? And she put her fingers in her ears and walked off and she actually went, la, 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 I'm not listening to you. And for me, that was the moment where I thought, that's why you can't teach RE, because you can't suddenly stick your fingers in your ears when someone says something you don't like or something you don't wish to discuss. But for her, she'd created a vacuous formulae. She'd created a formula where nothing could get in or out, that no amount of discussion, logic or questioning could then falsify that belief that she'd had. She'd created herself a vacuous formulae where no matter what I said made any difference at all. Not that I'd ever try and change somebody's views, of course. It's more about, and that's not what Mitchell's arguing. Mitchell is just saying about having the perception and the awareness of the views that are out there. So again, that's the end of falsification. I want you to look at which view you think is most convincing, Flew, Hare or Mitchell. Who presents the most convincing view? So Flew is cognitive, Hare's non-cognitive, Mitchell's cognitive. Which view? Do you think when people are talking about religious statements that they're talking about them cognitive or non-cognitive? Do you think it differs over different people? Which of their arguments do you think works best? Do you think falsifiability has some grounds? Okay, so the final section, language games. This is Ludwig Wittgenstein. When it comes to language games, I would probably go out on a limb and say that this is probably my favourite of all arguments. I think that language games for me makes an awful lot of sense. That's not to say that you will not, however, find problems with it. That's not to say that you, however, will agree with me, and that's absolutely fine. You do not agree with me. However, I do find great logic in what Wittgenstein has presented. So let's see what he says. First of all, anything interesting that you notice about this picture? Obviously, Wittgenstein is the one in the circle. Is there anybody else in that picture that stands out? Wittgenstein was the youngest of 8 and came from a wealthy, influential Viennese Jewish family. His father became rich through the steel business, so Wittgenstein inherited a fortune, allowing him to show his own interests. In the top, so if you see in the top right-hand corner for me, that young gentleman there is Adolf Hitler. And even from a very, very young age, we know that Adolf Hitler and his hatred of Jews was sparked even in childhood. He had an immense dislike and jealousy of Wittgenstein, who was from a wealthy family, who was clever, who inherited his family's fortune. So even from a very, very young age, Adolf Hitler's hatred was stemming in childhood. So yes, so youngest of 8 was Wittgenstein, and from Vienna. There he is. I think he's quite broodingly handsome. You probably will completely disagree with me. He does look a bit like kind of Frankenstein's doctor, though, Dr. Frankenstein. He does look a little bit on the scary side. Maybe a bit of a young brooding Johnny Depp. Maybe I've been in lockdown too long, who knows. But what it does say is, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. So what do you think it means by that, and do you agree? What do you think Wittgenstein means by that? Wittgenstein is probably one of the ultimate one-liners. He has so many one-liners out there, very, very popular for his one-liners with great meaning. So what do you think this one-liner means? Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. What does he mean, and do you agree? All right, so Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's writings had a strong influence on the Vienna Circle, especially his early work, Tractus Logica Philosophicus. Philosophicus, there we go. Wow, that was a big one. Sounds like a dinosaur. So where he attempted to set out the criteria to demonstrate what can and cannot be expressed in language. However, Wittgenstein was not a member of the Logical Positivists. He believed that reality is not all completely intelligible, understandable to us, so it's not all something that can be true or false. Many aspects of reality we can experience with our senses, yet other aspects, such as infinity or timelessness, we cannot, yet they still have meaning. For Wittgenstein, people should limit themselves to talking about only those parts of reality they can conceptualize. So only talk about things you can actually conceptualize, see, understand. The other areas may or may not be true, but we will never know. Therefore, we are always unable to talk about them meaningfully. So basically, you can talk about them, but it's never meaningful because you don't quite know. Really is the genuine, it is beyond your understanding, so don't even bother talking about it. However, later in life, Wittgenstein felt that he had been wrong about the limitations of the meaningfulness of language, that it was a bit harsh, and that his criteria was too narrow, moving instead towards what he called language games. So originally he basically just said, if you can't back it up, shut up about it, so to speak. That if you don't have the knowledge to back it up, don't talk about it at all. What's that phrase? I can't even think. No, it's not there. If you don't have any niceties, I don't say anything at all. That one about silence. If you, it's better to remain silent than to talk about things that the nonsense, so to speak. So what are language games? The meaning of words are determined by the language game the words are part of. So the words have meaning from the situation they're used in. So computers, mobile phones all have language. Wittgenstein used the example of chess. So he said that the rules state how the pieces can move. However, talk of a queen or pawns in any other context would not make sense. So my queen's taken your pawn. My knight took your queen. Those phrases would mean nothing if you were in the context of chess. Therefore, if you use the words that do not follow the particular rules, then you are talking nonsense. So he used the term Lebensform, or form of life, to signify the context in which language might be used. Sports commentating, for example, is a form of life, as is office administration, driving a steam train. So Wittgenstein gives this as another example, the steam train example, to explain how all the pedals, etc., would make no sense unless you were having a go at driving. So basically, there is a language. Everything has a language. Your family will have a language. Your friendship group will have a language. We have a language as a philosophy class. We have things that we say that only we understand. We have jokes that we get, etc. So these are language games. There's rules within that context. So there are certain things that you can and cannot say at home that you would say with your friends. There are certain things that you would not say in the classroom that you might say at home, for example. So you have to follow the rules within that language game. I remember years ago, one of my students said, "Yo, Ames." And I said, "I hope you're not talking to me." And obviously he'd got the language games and the rules confused. He'd confused the rules of the classroom with the rules of his friendship, calling me Ames and yo Ames. It still does make me laugh though to this day, even though I didn't let him know that at first. But that's the idea, that there are rules within the language game that you have. And this is a Lebensform. It's a form of life. Everything in life has a language game. Groundless beliefs. In uncertainty, Wittgenstein demonstrated how statements made are often groundless. You say things that have no backing evidence. E.g., we cannot justify the statements, "This is a PowerPoint." This is a PowerPoint. We cannot find reasoning to support why we call this a PowerPoint. It's just how we are educated to understand the world. Why is this a PowerPoint? What's its power? Definitions in this way are groundless beliefs, but they shape the way we understand the world to an enormous extent. For Wittgenstein, this is similar to religious beliefs. So views such as heaven and hell are groundless. Whether you believe in them or not, that's regardless. It's this idea that they're groundless because you cannot provide evidence for or against them. Therefore, it's not about facts, non-cognitive. It's not about these are being factual statements. They're non-cognitive statements. However, they shape the way we think and see the world nonetheless, so they still have importance. The more people participate in the religious behaviour, the more they will understand the language and the special meanings being part of that language game. As you become more immersed in the community of Christianity as a form of life, you will develop deeper understandings of what God loves us means in this context, and thus apply it to your own life. So basically, you understand the rules of your game. So if you talk about rosary, confirmation, confession, Sabbath. Obviously, Sabbath's Jewish. But any of these words that you use, Torah, Allah. All of these words have meaning within the religious context you use them in, and the more immersed you are in that religious context, the more words that you will understand and the more things. But you cannot talk about Allah within a Christian context, for example, because you're playing with two different games. You're playing two different roles with two different languages. So it's the idea that you can't use Monopoly rules on a game of Cluedo. This is the idea that you can't overlap rules. Quite often, if I ever play chess with anybody, there's certain rules that differ depending on who's playing it. So it's good to establish the rules of your game before you get going so that rules don't change halfway through. But it's the idea that you can't use rules from other games or language from other games in the game that you are playing. Supporters of this is D.Z. Phillips. He says religious language is meaningful for those who genuinely use it. It does not need to be justified to those who do not participate in that particular language game. You don't have to justify your faith belief. You don't have to justify your belief in God, your understandings of heaven and hell, your ideas of judgment or election to somebody that isn't part of your game. You don't have to justify it to somebody that doesn't understand it because they're in a different game to you, as long as you understand the rules of your game. Many of the terms and concepts only make sense when participating in that game. It makes no sense to talk of salvation, prayer, sin, communion outside of the religious context. And then Peter Donovan in Religious Language. Wow, what an original book title. He says that way of speaking is a useful reminder that misunderstandings and confusion are likely to result if statements are taken from their context and analysed without regard to the usual circumstances in which they are uttered. Basically, you have to put a statement within the context the statement was said in, otherwise it will make no sense. So when it comes to language games, Richard Dawkins is coming from his science language game over into a religious language game. You can't use your science words against religion. When religion is using words like belief and faith, you can't then use your science terms against it because you're playing two different games. And this isn't then for a religious person to explain to Dawkins about their language because he's not participating in their game. So that's why Dawkins does not understand religious belief because he's not part of that game. And again, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this? How might this influence this idea of how we interpret and understand religious texts? Finally, you need to decide whether you're team cognitive or non-cognitive, which is the best approach to understanding religious language. So cognitive is your verification, is your falsification, and we're going to do analogy and via negativa next week. Non-cognitive is hair, symbols and language, and we haven't again done symbols yet, so that's on the next one. But you need to keep these terms cognitive and non-cognitive at the forefront of your mind. They're very, very important. So that's the end of that PowerPoint. Hopefully you found this useful. This might be one of those that you need to go and do a little bit of wider research and understanding, but this is just one way you just accept what is said, you work through the evaluation, you pick which argument you think is more convincing, and we're talking about the meaningfulness of language. So when anyone talks about religious language, whatever it might be, is it meaningful or not, through verification, falsification and language games. If you do have any questions, don't forget to send me an email or pop a comment underneath. Otherwise, work through this one. Do your best. Any questions, of course, as I've said, do get in touch. Otherwise, next time I will be doing one on the second half of religious language. So see you for now, folks. Thanks very much. Bye, guys.